She had 14 berries left. That was all standing between her and the kind of hunger that stops being painful and starts being quiet. Maeve Holloway crouched beside a frost-bitten trail in the middle of Wyoming's Badlands, fingers purple from cold, counting those berries like they were gold coins. 27 years old, and already she had buried a husband, lost a home, and walked so far her boots had worn through at the heel. Most women would have turned back. Most women had something to turn back to. She didn't. What happened next on that lonely dirt road would change everything. Not just for her, but for a broken-down rancher who had stopped believing the world had anything left worth saving. If this story moves you, drop the name of your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. Hit like, and let's begin. The berries were called buffalo berries, and they were barely worth eating. Maeve knew that. She'd learned it the hard way 3 days ago when she'd eaten too many of them too fast and spent the better part of an afternoon crouched behind a juniper tree with her stomach in open revolt against her. But today she had 14 of them cupped in her palm, and her body wasn't making requests anymore. It was issuing demands. So she ate them slowly, one at a time, letting each one sit on her tongue for a moment before she chewed, not because she was savoring them, but because eating slowly was the only way to trick her stomach into thinking it had received something substantial. It hadn't. The trail she'd been following for the past 2 days cut through a high meadow that the October wind had already stripped bare. The grass was the color of old straw. The sky above the Bighorn foothills was the kind of pale, washed-out blue that carried cold in it the way a river carries sediment, everywhere, invisible, inescapable. Maeve had a wool coat, a canvas travel bag, and 43 cents. That was the full accounting of her possessions. She'd done the math so many times it had stopped feeling like a calculation and started feeling like a punishment. 43 cents. In October. In Wyoming. She hadn't planned to be here. She hadn't planned much of anything in the past 6 months, which was its own kind of mistake, but grief had a way of dissolving the part of your brain responsible for planning. When Thomas had died in April, not dramatically, not heroically, just quietly in a bed in a boarding house in Laramie with a rattling cough that had been getting worse since February, she'd thought the hard part was over. She'd been wrong about that in a way that still made her feel foolish. Thomas Holloway had been a man with grand ideas and small follow-through. She'd known that when she married him. She'd thought she could compensate for it. Instead, what she'd done was spend 4 years watching him accumulate debt the way other men accumulated livestock, with enthusiasm and without discipline. The creditors had come within 2 weeks of his burial, 3 of them in suits that didn't fit Wyoming, carrying papers with numbers on them that made Maeve sit down hard in the nearest chair. "You understand, Mrs. Holloway," the first one had said, almost gently, "that as his widow, these obligations—" "I understand," she'd said, because she did. She'd sold everything sellable. The furniture, the horse, Thomas's good watch, which she'd kept longer than she should have because it still smelled faintly like him when you held it close. In the end, she'd still come up short by an amount that might as well have been infinite for all her ability to cover it, and she'd left Laramie in early June with her travel bag and a plan that amounted to go somewhere else and figure it out. It was now October. She had not figured it out. She'd worked a few weeks in a hotel in Casper, washing linens until her hands cracked at the knuckles. She'd spent a month as a kitchen helper at a cattle operation outside Buffalo, which had ended when the operation's owner decided he'd rather not pay her for the last 2 weeks of work, and there wasn't a damn thing she could do about it. She'd tried to reach her cousin in Colorado by letter twice, and received no answer either time. She was beginning to suspect that the silence was intentional. So here she was, a dirt trail in the Bighorn Basin, 14 buffalo berries, and a pair of boots that had given up any pretense of keeping her feet dry. She finished the last berry and stood up, brushing her palm against her coat. Her legs ached from yesterday's walking. Not a dramatic ache, just a steady, low-grade protest that had become her constant companion over the past several weeks. She adjusted the strap of her travel bag on her shoulder and looked down the trail. Somewhere ahead was a town called Harlan's Crossing. She'd been told it was a day's walk. She'd been told that yesterday. She started walking. Beats. The sound reached her before the rider did. A slow, deliberate clop of hooves on hard ground, unhurried in the way that men are unhurried when they own the land they're crossing. Maeve stepped to the side of the trail without thinking about it, an instinct she'd developed over months of traveling alone. making herself smaller, less noticeable, giving trouble plenty of room to pass by. The horse that came around the bend in the trail was a dark roan with a white blaze down its nose, broad through the chest, the kind of horse that had done real work for real years and wore it without complaint. The man on its back was somewhere in his mid-30s, though hard weather and harder living had written their usual ambiguities across his face. He was lean in the way that comes from not eating enough and working too much, not from intention. Brown coat with a frayed collar, hat pulled low, a jaw that looked like it hadn't been properly introduced to a razor in at least a week. He saw her and slowed without stopping, which she noted. Most men she'd encountered on the trail had either sped up or stopped completely. Slowing was more careful, more considered. His eyes moved over her in the way a man's eyes move when they're actually looking rather than just seeing. Not inappropriate, cataloging. She recognized it because she did the same thing herself. "You're on foot," he said. "I am," she said. "A long way from anything." "I'm aware of that." He seemed to think about his next question before he asked it. "Where are you headed?" "Harlan's Crossing. I was told it was a day's walk." Something shifted in his expression. Not quite a wince. More like the face a person makes when they're deciding whether to say something true that isn't particularly welcome. "Whoever told you that was measuring a day by a different clock than most people use. On foot? In this weather?" He glanced at her boots, which told their own story. "You're looking at another full day at minimum, possibly two." Maeve absorbed this information. It didn't change anything about her situation, but there was something about having it confirmed by someone who had no particular reason to lie that made it feel heavier than it had when it was still just her own quiet suspicion. "Thank you for telling me," she said, and meant it. She moved to go around the horse. He didn't block her, made no move to stop her at all, but something in his expression changed again, some internal calculation completing itself. "Can you cook?" he asked. She stopped, looked back at him. "What?" "Cook." He seemed slightly uncomfortable with the question, like a man who has asked something before he'd entirely decided to. "Can you do it?" "I can cook." "For how many people?" She tilted her head. "How many people are you expecting?" "6 ranch hands. Myself." He paused. "Sometimes 7, if old Pete's back is acting up and he can't go out with the others." Maeve stood there with the wind pressing at the back of her coat and looked at this man on his dark roan horse. He wasn't looking at her with the particular brand of pity she'd gotten used to and had come to despise. The head tilt, the softened mouth, the "you poor thing" that people delivered like a gift when what they were actually giving you was their own discomfort dressed up in generosity. He was looking at her the way a man looks at a horse he's thinking of buying, evaluating, practical. "Can you cook for 2?" he asked. It was such an odd question, after everything he'd just said about 6 ranch hands and possibly 7, that it took her a moment to understand it. He wasn't asking if she could cook for 2 people. He was asking if it was a fair exchange, her labor for his roof and his table. "Yes," she said, "I can cook for 2. He nodded, like they'd settled something that had been uncertain. "My name is Caleb Ashcroft. I run a cattle operation about 4 miles north of here. The cook I had quit 3 weeks ago. I've been managing since then, which means the men have been eating things that nobody should have to eat more than once." He paused again. That seemed to be a habit of his, these small silences where other men might have rushed to fill the space. "The position comes with room, board, and a fair wage. I'd need you to start today. What's the wage?" He told her. It was modest. It was also more money than she'd seen in 2 months. "I'll need it paid weekly," she said. He considered this. "Bi-weekly." "Weekly," she said again, not unkindly, but without giving any ground. "I've been in arrangements where payment was delayed before. I won't do that again." Another one of his pauses, then, "Fair enough, weekly. Then we have an arrangement, Mr. Ashcroft." He dismounted with the efficiency of someone who has gotten on and off horses roughly 10,000 times and offered her the roan without ceremony. "Horses better used carrying a passenger than walking beside one," he said, by way of explanation. She looked at the horse. The horse looked back at her with the patient, vaguely judgmental expression that horses frequently wore. She'd ridden before. Not a great deal, but enough. "Thank you," she said, and meant that too. She got herself into the saddle with more grace than her exhausted legs wanted to provide, settled her bag across her lap, and waited while Caleb Ashcroft took the reins and started walking north. Neither of them said anything for a while. The wind moved through the dry grass alongside the trail. Somewhere behind the clouds, the sun was making its best effort at warmth, and not quite succeeding. "What's the horse's name?" she finally asked. "Horse," he said. She waited. "That's it? Just horse?" "He doesn't seem to mind." She looked down at the roan's ears, which were moving independently of each other in the manner of horses who are paying attention to more than one thing simultaneously. "What happened to your last cook?" "His wife had a baby. Decided he wanted to be closer to her family in Nebraska." A beat. "Good man. Bad timing." "And before him?" Caleb glanced back at her briefly. "Why?" "I like to know the history of a position," she said. "It tells you things about a place that the person offering the job won't always think to mention." He was quiet for a moment. She had the impression she'd either impressed him slightly or irritated him, and she couldn't quite tell which. Before him there was a woman named Clara Detch. She was there for almost 2 years. She left when her brother sent for her from Kansas City. Another pause. "The year before that, I managed the cooking myself, and the year before that, He stopped. Just cut the sentence off, clean as a knife through rope. "There was someone else. She's gone." Maeve didn't ask who. The way he'd said she's gone wasn't an invitation to continue. It was a door, and it was closed, and she had enough closed doors of her own to understand when not to knock. "All right," she said simply. And they walked on, the man and the woman and the horse with no name, through the October grass, toward a ranch that neither of them knew would change the shape of both their lives. The Ashcroft Ranch came into view slowly, the way things reveal themselves from a distance on flat land. First just a dark smudge against the afternoon sky, then gradually resolving itself into structures, fences, the geometry of intentional human occupation carved out of wild country. Maeve's first impression was, it's been neglected, not ruined, not beyond saving, but neglected in the specific way of a place that had once been properly cared for and had gone some time without that care. Weeds taking the fence line, a section of the barn roof that had been patched with boards that didn't quite match, a front porch step that was cracked through the middle and hadn't been replaced. The house itself was substantial, 2 stories, built with the kind of careful intention that had required real money and real effort at some point in the past. But it wore the present the way a good suit wears hard use, the quality still visible underneath the wear, but the wear impossible to ignore. She filed this information away without comment. The ranch hands were gathered near the barn when they came in, 3 of them visible, 2 more emerging from the far side of the corral when they heard the horse. They stopped and stared at Maeve in the open, guileless way of men who spend most of their time in the company of other men and have forgotten how to be subtle about surprise. "That our new cook?" said one of them, young, freckled, with ears that had gotten ahead of the rest of his face. He was looking at Maeve with an expression of such uncomplicated hope that she found it almost touching. "Her name is Mrs. Holloway," Caleb said, with a mild but distinct emphasis on the Mrs. that served its communicative function clearly. "She'll be taking over the kitchen. Somebody show her where things are." "I can find my way," Maeve said, and got herself down from the horse without waiting for assistance. Her legs reminded her, upon impact with the ground, that they had opinions about this situation, and all of them were negative. She kept her expression neutral. "I'm Danny," said the freckled young man, apparently unable to help himself. "I've been doing the cooking since Pete left, and I want to apologize in advance for whatever state you find the kitchen in." "What state is it in?" He winced. "There may be a pot that's unsalvageable." "Which pot?" "The big cast iron one. I had an incident with—" "Don't worry about it," she said. "Just show me." The kitchen was worse than she'd expected, which was saying something because she'd expected it to be bad. The cast iron pot Danny had mentioned was sitting in the corner with the guilty, hunched aspect of an object that knows it has done something wrong and is hoping not to be looked at directly. Whatever had been cooked in it last had fused to the bottom with a permanence that suggested geological processes had been involved. The work table was sticky in a way she preferred not to investigate. 3 separate things in the cold storage pantry had gone completely and enthusiastically off, and the smell that emerged when she opened the door hit her like a physical object. She closed the pantry door, opened it again. Identified the offenders. a block of cheese that had achieved an entirely new color, something that might once have been salt pork, and what she believed had originally been a head of cabbage, but had evolved into something more philosophical. She removed them, set them outside the back door for disposal later, opened both kitchen windows despite the cold. Then she stood in the middle of the kitchen and looked at what she actually had to work with. The flour barrel was about a third full. There were dried beans, several pounds of them, which was good, salt, baking powder, lard, some dried sage, and what looked like it might have been thyme once, though thyme had diminished its ambitions. Half a smoked ham hanging in the back corner of the pantry that was still sound. Onions. 2 dozen eggs from what she later discovered were 6 bad-tempered hens that lived behind the barn and had to be negotiated with every morning. She could work with this. She found an apron on a hook by the door. It was a man's apron, enormous on her, but she tied it twice and got to work. She had no dramatic agenda that first evening. She wasn't trying to prove anything or make any kind of statement. She was simply a woman who knew how to cook, faced with a set of ingredients and hungry men, doing the things she knew how to do. She made bean soup with the ham bone and the dried beans, which required several hours of simmering time she didn't have, so she improvised, soaking the beans in hot water first and keeping the pot at a hard simmer, building the base with the onions and a generous amount of the smoked ham cut into small pieces, so the flavor would be throughout rather than concentrated. While that went, she made biscuits. Good ones. She'd made biscuits so many times that the process lived in her hands more than her head. The right texture of the dough identifiable by feel, the proper amount of working in of the lard, something she knew without measuring. She also cleaned the kitchen while the soup simmered. Not thoroughly. That would take days, but enough. The work table scrubbed down. The unsalvageable pot hauled outside to join the departed cheese and cabbage. The floor swept. Small practical improvements made in the hours she had available. The men came in for supper at the sound of the bell she found on the back porch and rang with perhaps more authority than strictly necessary. They filed into the kitchen with the careful, slightly wary manner of people who have been disappointed by meals recently and are trying not to get their hopes up. Caleb Ashcroft came in last, hung his hat on the hook by the door, and sat at the head of the table without comment. Maeve set the soup pot in the middle of the table and the biscuits in a cloth-lined basket beside it and stepped back. Nobody moved for a moment. Then Danny, she'd already identified Danny as the one incapable of pretending about things, said, "Oh," in a small voice, as though he'd received news he hadn't been expecting. They ate. Quietly at first, with the focused attention of truly hungry people. Then gradually, as the soup did its work and the biscuits proved themselves, the kitchen filled with the low sounds of men settling into comfort. Someone asking someone else to pass the basket. A brief murmured exchange about something that had happened in the north pasture. The particular silence of satisfaction rather than the particular silence of endurance. Caleb Ashcroft ate steadily and said nothing. But halfway through his second bowl of soup, he looked up at her where she stood by the stove. She hadn't sat. There'd been no place set for her, and she hadn't thought to ask, and gave her a single, brief nod. It wasn't praise, it wasn't gratitude exactly. It was acknowledgement. You did what you said you could do. For some reason, that mattered to her more than the effusive appreciation Danny provided after the meal, practically tripping over himself to tell her it was the best food he'd eaten since his mother's table in Indiana. After the men had gone, she sat down alone at the kitchen table and ate what was left in the pot. Still warm, still good, with a biscuit she'd saved for herself. Her feet hurt. Her back was making its feelings known. Outside, the Wyoming wind was pushing at the walls of the house in the testing way it had, looking for weaknesses. She was inside. She was fed. She had a week's wages coming to her at the end of 7 days. She ate her soup and did not cry, which felt, in that moment, like its own kind of victory. Her room was small, at the back of the house on the ground floor, probably intended as a storage room at some point, given its proximity to the kitchen. It contained a narrow bed with a thin mattress, a washstand, a nail on the wall that served as a wardrobe, and a single small window that looked out on the back of the property toward where the chicken coop sat in the darkness. It was cold. She could feel the wind through the window frame. She unpacked her travel bag onto the bed. The inventory was approximately what it had been for months, 2 changes of clothes, a nightgown, a hairbrush with 3 missing teeth, a small knife she kept wrapped in a piece of leather, Thomas's photograph, which she still carried without fully understanding why, some stubborn loyalty to the person she'd been when she'd loved him uncomplicated, and the little notebook she'd been keeping since June. Not a diary exactly, more of an accounting. Money earned, money spent, what she'd observed in each place she'd been. She looked at Thomas's photograph for a moment. He was smiling in it, which was how she preferred to remember him even when the debt memories tried to crowd that version out. He'd had a good smile. That part had been real. She put the photograph at the bottom of the bag and made herself ready for bed. She didn't sleep immediately. The unfamiliar sounds of the house kept her awake longer than she'd expected. The settling of the walls, the way the wind moved across the roof, a sound from somewhere upstairs that she eventually identified as Caleb Ashcroft's footsteps, pacing. He paced for what seemed like a long time. Back and forth, slow and regular, the way a person paces when their head won't let them rest. She lay in her narrow bed in her storage room and listened to the rancher she barely knew walk the floor above her, and thought about what it meant to be trapped in a place, not by walls, but by whatever it is that keeps a person circling the same grief over and over without being able to set it down. She knew something about that. You and me both, she thought, at the ceiling. And eventually, despite everything, she slept. The first week established a routine. She was up before the men. Before the sun, actually, which in October in Wyoming came later than she'd been used to in Laramie. She got the stove going, started whatever needed long cooking time, oatmeal or beans, or on the mornings when she'd planned properly, a pot of pork and potato hash that the ranch hands consumed with an enthusiasm that was almost alarming. She learned the rhythms of the kitchen, which drawers stuck, which burner ran hot, how long the oven took to come up to temperature, and how temperamental it was about staying there. She learned the hens, 5 of them consistent producers, one of them, a large, hostile bird she privately named Gertrude, who laid when she felt like it and did not feel like it as often as one might hope. She also, carefully and without making a performance of it, began assessing the broader situation of the ranch. She did this not out of idle curiosity, but out of the instinct, developed over 4 years of managing Thomas's disastrous financial life, to understand the things she'd walked into before it had the chance to surprise her. She listened to the conversations at the supper table. She noticed which things the hands mentioned needing and which things they mentioned having run out of. She watched how Caleb moved through the ranch, what he checked, what he walked past without checking, where he spent his time. He was a man of systematic habit. Up before her most mornings, out to the barn first, then the pasture fence line, then back by 7 for breakfast. He ate without conversation. He gave instructions in the brief, unelaborated way of a man who expects to be understood and usually is. He didn't talk about himself. When she asked him practical questions about the root cellar, about where the supply orders came from, about whether there was a schedule for which fields the cattle were moved through, he answered them completely, without impatience, and then didn't speak further. She found she didn't mind this. She'd spent 4 years with a man who never stopped talking and had not, when it came down to it, said particularly much that was useful. "You ask a lot of questions," Danny said to her on the 4th day, in the easy, artless way he said most things. "I like to understand how things work," she said. "Mr. Ashcroft said something about that." She looked at him. "Did he?" "Said you had a good eye for a place," Danny offered, clearly trying to be complimentary and slightly missing the mark, the way young men frequently do. She went back to kneading the bread dough she'd been working. "How long have you been out here, Danny?" "Going on 3 years. Came from Indiana when I was 19. He was 22 now, maybe, which put his face's unformed quality into context. "Mr. Ashcroft gave me a chance when I didn't have much else going. I figure I owe him." "What do you mean, gave you a chance?" Danny shrugged in the loose-jointed way of young men in general. "I showed up here with no real experience and a letter from a man who wasn't related to me saying I was a hard worker and a decent person. Most ranchers would have sent me on my way. Mr. Ashcroft said he'd try me for a month." He paused. That was 3 years ago. She thought about that. It was useful information about the kind of man Caleb Ashcroft was, or at least the kind of man he'd been at some point, the point before whatever had happened that had put those pacing footsteps in his nights. What about the others? She asked. Same story? More or less. Danny leaned against the doorframe, apparently having appointed himself her conversational companion for the afternoon. Pete's been here the longest, 12 years maybe. Walt and Red came together from Texas about 18 months back. Hank's been here 2 years. A pause. Mr. Ashcroft doesn't go through men fast. Once somebody's here and working well, they tend to stay. She noted that too. A rancher who kept his hands long-term was either paying them fair or making them feel they had a stake in the place, usually both. Either way, it spoke to something. You're thinking about it, Danny said. About what? About whether this is a good place to stay. He seemed pleased with himself for having read her correctly. I can tell. You've got that look. What look? The one where you're calculating something and your face goes very still. She blinked at him. He was more observant than his cheerful surface suggested. And what's your professional opinion, Danny? Is it a good place to stay? He considered this with more seriousness than she'd expected. It used to be better, he said, finally. Things got harder about 2 years back. The prices dropped on beef, and Mr. Ashcroft, he stopped. He changed, she finished. Not bad change, Danny said quickly. He's not a hard man. He's never been a hard man. He just went, he searched for the word and came up with quieter, like he went somewhere inside himself and didn't quite come all the way back. She nodded slowly and turned back to her bread dough. He was different before, Danny added, and then seemed to realize he'd said enough and pushed himself off the doorframe. I should get back. Yes, she said. You probably should. On the 6th day, she found the ledger. She hadn't been looking for it. She'd been searching for a receipt she'd vaguely remembered seeing, something about a supply order, when she'd opened the wrong drawer in the small desk in the room off the kitchen that Caleb used for whatever minimal ranch paperwork he did indoors. The ledger was sitting on top of a pile of papers, thick and cloth-covered, the kind of book that was meant to be a permanent record. She should have closed the drawer. She knew that. She'd certainly had enough people go through her own papers, the creditors, after Thomas, to know what a violation it felt like. But she opened it, just a little, just enough to see the first few entries. 10 minutes later, she was sitting in the chair she'd pulled up to the desk, reading carefully, and what she was seeing was putting a slow, cold weight in her chest. The ranch wasn't broke, but it was walking a line that was thinner than Caleb Ashcroft's careful, taciturn manner would suggest. Cattle prices had indeed fallen. She'd heard that mentioned in general terms, but now she could see the specific shape of it in the numbers. The ranch's income had dropped significantly over the past 2 years, while its fixed costs, feed, hired hands, supply runs, maintenance, had remained roughly stable. There was a debt to Harlan's Western Bank, which she presumed was in the nearby town of Harlan's Crossing, that had been there for several years and was, under normal circumstances, serviceable. Under present circumstances, it was starting to look like a rock somebody was balancing on their chest while treading water. She heard the back door and closed the ledger and was back in the kitchen before Caleb came through, hanging his coat on the hook. He looked at her. She looked at him. She said, "Supper's in an hour." "All right," he said. He went upstairs. She stood in the kitchen for a moment with the image of those numbers still sitting behind her eyes like a bruise you can't see but can feel. She put it away. She had no authority here, no position that entitled her to worry about it. She was the cook. She cooked. She got supper on. But she couldn't quite leave it alone. She began paying attention differently after that. Not to what the men said at the table, but to what they said around the edges of things. The sighs, the small exchanges that stopped when she came within earshot. The way Pete, the oldest of the ranch hands, would sometimes look at Caleb with an expression that mixed loyalty and concern in a way that was hard to witness without feeling it yourself. And she started noticing the cattle. She wasn't a rancher. She'd grown up in a small town in eastern Nebraska, the daughter of a school teacher, and her knowledge of cattle was approximately equivalent to her knowledge of naval navigation. But she had eyes, and over the following weeks, as October turned toward November and the cold came down properly, she noticed that there was a small group of steers, 11 of them, kept in the near pasture rather than out with the main herd, that were considerably thinner than the others. Bony across the hips, dull through the coat. They stood with the vague, uninspired manner of animals who were being maintained at a level somewhat below their potential. What's wrong with those ones? She asked Danny one afternoon when she'd gone out to wrangle Gertrude back into the coop and found herself looking at the near pasture. Nothing, Danny said. They're just light. Calves from last spring that didn't finish out right. The good grazing's been eaten down since we moved the main herd north. Those ones are on what's left. What happens to them? Well, Danny said, in the tone of a man about to deliver mildly bad news. When the bank man comes in the spring, Mr. Gantry, he's the loan agent from Harlan's Crossing. The plan is to sell the whole herd plus those ones together. But those ones, the way they are now, they won't get much at market. Underweight steers pull down the average. She looked at the 11 steers. They looked back at her with the stoic, slightly put-upon expressions of animals who have opinions about their situation, but limited means of expressing them. She went back to the kitchen. She started setting aside kitchen scraps. Not garbage. Not potato peels and coffee grounds. The good stuff that ordinarily went to waste. The coal from the oat bags. The cracked corn she found in the feed room that nobody was using. The ends of the sourdough loaves that the men didn't finish, soaked in water and mashed. She added them to the near pasture feed without announcing it to anyone. It wasn't a plan, exactly. Not at first. It was just the instinct of someone who could not watch a fixable problem go unfixed. By mid-November, she could see the difference in the steers already. Small, but real. She was keeping notes in her little book. Not just observations anymore. Numbers. The scraps she was adding, the estimated weight gain, the difference it would make at market if an underweight steer could be brought up even 80 pounds. She did the calculation 3 times because she didn't trust herself to have gotten it right the first 2 times. She put the number down, stared at it, looked at the 11 steers through the kitchen window, put the notebook away, got supper on. December arrived with the particular thoroughness of Wyoming winters, which do not mess around and do not apologize. The first real snow came on a Tuesday, and by Wednesday morning, the world outside the ranch house windows was white in every direction, and the temperature had dropped to the kind of number that made your eyes water when you stepped outside. Maeve had grown up with Nebraska winters. She was not surprised by cold. What surprised her was the ranch and the way it changed in winter, tightened, the men spending more time in proximity with less to occupy them. A tension building at the supper table that hadn't been there in October when there was more work than hours in the day to do it. It was at supper on a Thursday in the second week of December that Caleb said, "Gantry's coming early." The table went quiet in a specific way. Not the comfortable quiet of men eating, but the quality of quiet that enters a room when something unwelcome has been named. "How early?" Pete asked. He was a man of about 50, weathered dark, with a long mustache that he smoothed with his thumb when he was concerned. He was smoothing it now. "February." Caleb looked at his plate. "He sent a letter. He's moving the payment date up by 2 months." "He can do that?" Danny asked. "Apparently so. The terms allow for it." He said it without expression, but Maeve had been watching Caleb Ashcroft for 2 months now, and she'd developed through sheer proximity and attention a working knowledge of what his silences meant. This one was the kind that covered something he didn't want seen. "What does that mean for the sale?" Pete asked. "It means we need to have the money sooner than planned." Caleb set his fork down. "The herd's in good shape. We should be able to cover it if the prices hold." "And if they don't hold?" Red said from the end of the table. He was a quiet man who rarely spoke at meals, which meant that when he did speak, people listened. Caleb was quiet for a moment. "We'll manage," he said. Nobody looked convinced, including, she suspected, Caleb. She cleared the plates. She did not say anything. But that night, in her room, she got out the little notebook and did the calculation again. 11 steers. 8 more weeks of the kitchen scrap feeding schedule. She'd been keeping a weight estimate, not precise, but directional. She knew enough about the rhythm of it now to make reasonable projections. If she was right, those 11 steers, which in October would have been worth a disappointing amount at market, would by February have added enough weight to close a gap. The gap wasn't large. That was the thing. That was what the numbers were telling her. It wasn't a catastrophic shortfall. It was a specific, irritating, entirely bridgeable shortfall, and she knew exactly where the bridge was. She wrote the numbers out cleanly, added them up, checked them again, closed the notebook, put it under her mattress, looked at the ceiling. Somewhere above her, the footsteps had started. back and forth, carrying their freight of whatever it was that wouldn't let Caleb Ashcroft rest. She thought, I need to tell him. She thought, it's not my place. She thought, it's absolutely my place. I've been feeding those steers for 2 months. She lay there in the dark with Wyoming winter pressing at the walls and listened to the man pace himself in circles around a problem that she could see the solution to and wondered how long she was going to keep the things she knew to herself. Not much longer, as it turned out. She was not a woman who had ever been particularly good at staying quiet, when staying quiet meant watching something preventable get worse. She went to him the next evening, after supper, after the men had gone. He was in the small desk room with the ledger. She could see the lamplight under the door. She knocked. Come in? She pushed the door open. He looked up from the ledger with an expression that was purely neutral, the way his expressions usually were. She held up her notebook. I need to show you something, she said. He looked at the notebook, looked at her. All right. She sat down across from him without waiting to be invited and opened the notebook to the page with the numbers. Those 11 steers in the near pasture, she said. I've been supplementing their feed for the past 8 weeks. She watched something shift in his face. Not anger, but something unreadable. She kept going. Kitchen scraps, coal grain from the feed room, old bread soaked down. I know I should have asked. I didn't ask. I'm telling you now. She turned the notebook so he could see the numbers. If we keep the schedule through February, by the time Mr. Gantry comes, those steers will have put on enough weight to close the gap between what you have and what you owe him. Caleb Ashcroft was still. Very still. The way he went when he was actually listening rather than just waiting for speech to finish. He looked at the notebook. She watched him process the numbers. She could see him doing it, the same methodical quality he brought to everything, working through the calculation, checking it internally against what he knew. He was quiet for a long moment. You've been reading my ledger, he said. Yes, she said. I'm sorry. I found it by accident and I didn't stop when I should have. Another silence. And instead of saying something, you started feeding the steers. I didn't know how to bring it up. I thought, She stopped, tried again. I thought if I was right about what the feeding would do, I'd have something more than just concern to bring you. Something useful. He looked at her. Just looked at her. For long enough that she started to wonder whether she'd completely misjudged this and was about to be sent packing. Are these numbers right? He said. Check them yourself, she said, and slid the notebook across to him. He looked at them for a while. She waited. Yeah, he said finally. Just that. Yeah. She waited again. That would cover it, he said, if you're right about the weight gain. I think I'm right. I've been watching them every week. He set the notebook down on top of his ledger. His hand stayed on it for a moment, not moving. Something was working its way across his face that she didn't have a name for yet. She'd learned to read a fair amount of his silences, but this one was different. This one had more in it than usual. Mrs. Holloway, he said. Maeve, she said, because they'd been living in the same house for 2 months, and she was tired of the formality. Call me Maeve. He looked at her again with that same unreadable expression. Maeve, he said. Why? She understood what he was asking. Not why did you feed the steers? Say, that answer was practical and obvious. He was asking the harder question. Why are you doing this? Why are you in my ledger, in my near pasture, calculating the difference between my debt and my salvation? She thought about how to answer that honestly. Because I've lived in the consequences of financial ruin, she said, and I know what it looks like building toward you when you can't quite see it yet. And I thought, she stopped again, then pushed forward. I thought it would be a shame for this place. It's a good ranch. It's been a good ranch. I can see that even in what it is now. He was looking at her with an intensity that was unusual for him. Most of the time, his eyes were where information went in, not where it came out. But right now, something was coming out. It was better, he said, before. I know, she said. You couldn't know, he said. You weren't here. No, she said. But Danny told me some things. And you tell me other things without telling me. The way you walk the fence line in the north pasture first every morning. The way you look at the house sometimes when you come in from outside. The way you pace at night. She stopped, wondering if that had been too much. "I'm sorry, that last part is none of my business." He was very quiet. "I don't pace," he said. "You do," she said, gently. "I can hear you through the floor of my room." Something cracked, very slightly, in his careful, neutral expression. Not dramatically, just a small fracture. A crack in a wall that let you see for just a moment how thick the wall was. "My wife," he said. "She died 2 years ago." "I'm sorry," Maeve said. "She liked this ranch," he said. "She was the one who—" He picked up the notebook, set it down again. "She would have noticed those steers in October, would have done exactly what you did." Maeve didn't say anything. There wasn't anything to say that wouldn't diminish what he'd just told her. After a moment, Caleb stood. He picked up her notebook and handed it back to her. "Keep the feeding schedule," he said. "I'll look at what we have in the grain room and see if we can add to it properly instead of relying on kitchen odds and ends." "All right," she said. And Maeve— he was looking at her with that stripped-open quality that she suspected he would wall back off by morning and probably never show again so directly. "Thank you." She nodded, once, stood up, went to the door. "Caleb," she said, because it seemed only fair if she was going to insist on her own name. Something almost moved at the corner of his mouth. "Good night," he said. "Good night," she said, and went back to her kitchen. Outside, the snow was coming down again, thick and steady, covering everything. Inside the ranch house, a lamp burned in the small desk room where a man was bent over a ledger, recalculating, and in the kitchen a woman was writing in a small notebook, adding the latest numbers to the ones she'd already kept. The 11 steers stood in the near pasture, breathing steam into the dark winter air, unhurried and patient, quietly doing the work that had been asked of them. The cold pressed at the walls of the old house. The house pushed back. The morning after she showed Caleb the notebook, nothing was different, and everything was different. That was the only way she could describe it to herself. Standing at the stove before sunrise with the coffee starting to come up and the cold still sitting in the kitchen corners where the heat from the stove hadn't reached yet, the ranch looked the same through the window. The snow was the same snow. The 11 steers were in the near pasture doing what they always did, which was stand there and breathe and exist with the magnificent indifference of cattle everywhere. But something had shifted. She could feel it the way you feel a change in weather before it arrives. Not in any single thing you can point to, but in the pressure of the air around you. Caleb came down at his usual time, hung his coat, poured his coffee. He didn't say anything about the previous evening. She didn't either. But when he set his cup down on the table and she set his breakfast in front of him, their eyes met for a moment in the way that two people's eyes meet when they have said something real to each other and are now navigating what comes after. He looked away first, ate his breakfast, went out to the barn. She stood at the window with her own coffee and watched him cross the yard through the thin morning light, his breath making small clouds in the cold air, and thought, all right then, that's how it is. She could work with that. January was brutal in the specific, unrelenting way of Bighorn Basin winters, which did not offer the comfort of variety. It was cold, and then it was colder, and then it snowed, and then it was cold again. The men spent more time inside, which meant they were underfoot more, which meant the kitchen became a kind of center of gravity for the whole operation, the warmest room in the house, the room that smelled like something worth coming in from the cold for. Maeve had always understood, without ever having articulated it exactly, that feeding people well was not a neutral act. It did things to a group of men. It changed the quality of their silences, the ease of their conversation, the way they held themselves at the end of a hard day. She'd seen it in the boarding houses and work camps she'd passed through since Laramie. The difference between a table where people ate to stop being hungry and a table where people ate and felt, for a while, like they were somewhere that wanted them. She worked at making the Ashcroft Ranch kitchen the second kind of table. It wasn't always easy. She had limited supplies, and Wyoming in January made resupply irregular. She developed a particular creativity with dried beans and salt pork that the men came to accept as a fact of winter life, and she made 2 kinds of bread because she'd noticed that Danny ate white bread plain and without enthusiasm, but ate the darker, denser oat loaf, like a man who had been personally wronged by hunger and was getting his revenge. She made pie when she had the ingredients for it, and when she didn't, she made things that were adjacent to pie. A baked apple dish with brown sugar and cinnamon that Pete called good enough to make a man reconsider his feelings about fruit, which she took as high praise. She also started talking to the men, not performing conversation, not the bright managed sociability she'd sometimes had to produce in her hotel work days, just actually talking, the way she'd talk to anyone she was stuck in a building with for months on end and needed to understand. She learned that Red's real name was Harlan, which nobody used because there was a town called Harlan's Crossing, and it created confusion, and that he'd come to Wyoming from Texas not because he'd wanted to, but because there was a woman in Texas who'd made staying inadvisable. She learned that Walt, who was quiet and methodical and never seemed to have a strong opinion about anything, had opinions about horses that were the opposite of quiet, specific, passionate, occasionally combative opinions that he'd share at length if you asked him the right question and then couldn't stop. She learned that Pete had a daughter in Cheyenne who sent letters he read at the table and then folded very carefully and put in his breast pocket and didn't mention, and that this was a communication he carried against his chest through the rest of whatever day it arrived on. She learned these things not to use them, but because people who are known tend to work differently than people who aren't. They show up with more of themselves. They fill more of the space they're supposed to fill. By the third week of January, the kitchen table after supper had become the place where things got decided. Not formally, not with any structure, but in the casual, sideways way that things actually get decided among people who work together and have started to trust each other. A fence section that needed repair. A decision about which cattle to rotate south before the next storm. Small things. The kind of things that Caleb used to handle by quiet decree, and the men used to accept without comment, now running through a conversation that included pushback and suggestions and, occasionally, Maeve's specific and useful opinion about something she'd observed that the men hadn't thought to mention to Caleb directly. Caleb noticed this. She knew he noticed because he watched it with a quality of attention that was different from his usual watchfulness. Less supervisory, more genuinely interested. The way a man watches something he didn't expect and is trying to understand. One evening, he stayed at the table after the others had gone, which was unusual. She was washing the supper dishes, her back to him, and she heard him not leave. "You know," he said, "before you came, those conversations at supper were—" He stopped. "They weren't conversations." She kept washing. "I know. Danny told me." "Danny talks too much." "Danny talks the right amount," she said. "He just talks it to whoever's available, which is sometimes not the most strategic choice." She heard something that might have been a low exhale of amusement, though she wasn't certain. She set a clean pan on the rack and turned around. He was sitting with his coffee cup in his hands, looking at the table. Not at her. At the table, at the particular spot in the middle of it where the conversation had been happening an hour ago. "It was like that before," he said. "When Margaret was alive, the kitchen was—" He stopped again. He did that a lot, started sentences that contained the word Margaret, and then ran out of momentum before the end. It was the same kind of room. Maeve dried her hands on her apron. She sat down at the other end of the table from him, which felt like the right distance. "How long were you married?" 7 years. "Were they good years?" He looked up at her. The question had surprised him slightly. She could see it. Most people, when someone mentioned a dead spouse, offered sympathy and then steered away from the specifics. She'd found, from her own experience, that this was not always what people actually wanted. "Yeah," he said. "Most of them. We argued about money sometimes. She thought I was too careful with it, and I thought she was—" He almost smiled. Almost. "She bought 2 horses one summer without telling me first. Good horses, but still. She sounds like she knew what she was doing. She almost always did." He looked back at the table. That was the frustrating part. Maeve understood that. The particular frustration of loving someone competent. "I'm sorry," she said, "about losing her." "It was 2 years ago," he said, in the tone of someone who has been told, often enough to have started telling themselves, that 2 years is a sufficient amount of time. 2 years isn't very long," she said. He looked at her again. She held the look. "No," he said, "it isn't." She got up and took his empty coffee cup to the counter and refilled it without asking. and brought it back, and he took it with the brief, unornamented nod he gave when he meant thank you. She went back to the dishes. She would have liked you, he said after a while. I don't know that, Maeve said. I do, he said. She liked people who got things done without making a performance of it. Maeve thought about the notebook under her mattress, and the 11 steers in the near pasture, and the 2 months of kitchen scraps she'd been carrying out without telling anyone. I'm not always subtle about it, she said. You're more subtle than you think. She wasn't sure that was a compliment or an observation, but she decided not to examine it too closely. She finished the dishes, said goodnight, went to her room. She didn't hear him pacing that night, or if she did, she fell asleep before it registered. February arrived with a letter. Not from Gantry, the bank agent. That appointment was still 2 weeks out, and Caleb had received a confirmation of the date, but no additional surprises from that direction. The letter that changed things came on a Wednesday in the first week of February, addressed to Caleb in a hand that was careful and commercial, and when he read it at the breakfast table, the quality of his stillness changed, in a way that made Pete look up from his food with an old man's instinct for trouble. What is it? Pete said. Caleb set the letter down. Gantry's bringing someone with him, a man named Doyle. Who's Doyle? Danny asked. Regional representative, Caleb said, for the bank. The table was quiet. Maeve was at the stove, her back to them, and she kept her movements even and unhurried. Why would the bank send a regional representative? Red said. Caleb folded the letter. I don't know yet, but she could hear in the silence that followed that he had ideas, and none of them were comfortable ones, and the men at the table could hear it too because they ate the rest of breakfast without the usual back and forth and went out to work without lingering the way they'd been doing lately on cold mornings. After they'd gone, Caleb was still sitting at the table. Maeve turned around. Can I read it? She asked. He looked at her for a moment. Then he slid the letter across the table. She picked it up and read it. It was formal, dry, the language of institutions that have learned to say things without technically saying them. But the bones of it were clear enough, and her stomach did the particular sinking thing it did when numbers started to arrange themselves into a shape she recognized. She put the letter down. He's not coming to collect the payment, she said. No, Caleb said. He's coming to assess the property. Yes. She sat down, not at the far end of the table, at the near end, 2 seats away from him. That's what the early payment date was about. If you can't pay in February, the assessment gives them grounds to move on the property before the spring sale would have given you a chance to cover it. Caleb looked at her steadily. You understand bank procedures. I understand debt, she said. My late husband left me very well educated in the subject. He was quiet for a moment. His name is Doyle, he said. The regional man. I've heard of him. He goes into a territory when the bank has identified properties worth acquiring and works the numbers until there's a legitimate case for foreclosure. Does he manufacture the case or find it? Finds it, Caleb said. He's too careful to manufacture it, but he knows where to look for the weakness, and he knows how to frame what he finds. Maeve sat with this information for a moment. Outside, she could hear the wind picking up, rattling the kitchen window in its frame. The stove ticked and settled. How long do we have? She noticed that she'd said we, and from the slight shift in his expression, he'd noticed too, but neither of them addressed it. 14 days, he said. Then we need to talk about the steers. She got the notebook from her room, and they spent an hour at the kitchen table going through the numbers together. The first time she'd done anything like this with another person since she used to sit up late with Thomas going through his bills, except that this was the inverse of that experience in almost every way, because the numbers were going in the right direction, and the person across the table was listening rather than rationalizing. Caleb was a better mathematician than she'd expected, or maybe not better but faster. He'd grown up with ranch ledgers and could move through calculations in his head that she needed paper for. What she had that he lacked, or that he'd stopped exercising in the past 2 years of managing by sheer persistence rather than strategy, was the habit of looking at numbers from multiple angles, of asking what happens if instead of assuming what is. If the steers are at the weight I think they are, she said, and we sell them separate from the main herd, not bundled in with the overall sale but presented as a distinct lot, we can set a price on them specifically. A buyer would need to come out to see them. Is there a buyer you trust? Ferris, in Harlan's Crossing. He's a fair man. He's bought from me before. Can you get him out here in the next 10 days? Caleb looked at her. Before Gantry and Doyle arrive. Before they arrive, she confirmed. If we've already sold that lot and have the payment in hand, Doyle has nothing to assess that improves the bank's position. The debt's paid. He came a long way for nothing. Something moved through Caleb's expression that she wouldn't quite call satisfaction. It was more complicated than that, and colder. You want to have the payment waiting on the table when they walk in. I want the payment to already be completed when they walk in, she said. Past tense. Nothing to discuss. He looked at the notebook again, at her numbers, which were neat and carefully kept, with the dates of each feeding adjustment noted in the margin. He'd been looking at them with the same quality of attention he gave the fence line in the mornings. Systematic, checking everything twice. You've been doing this since November, he said. October, she said. I started in mid-October. 4 months? Yes. He was quiet for what felt like a long time. The wind pushed at the window. The stove ticked. Why didn't you tell me sooner? He asked. Not accusatory, genuinely asking. She considered how honest to be, and then decided that this was not a moment for anything less than full honesty. Because when I first got here, I wasn't sure you'd still be here in February. Not you personally. I mean, the ranch, the operation. And I thought if it didn't last, having told you about something I'd done without permission would just be an uncomfortable conversation for no purpose. She paused. And then after I knew the ranch was going to be here in February, I needed the numbers to be solid enough that I wasn't bringing you a hope. I wanted to bring you a calculation. He was looking at her very directly now. And when did you decide the numbers were solid enough? The night I showed you the notebook. He nodded slowly, looking down at the table. Then he looked back up at her. Write me a clean copy of the weight estimates and the projected sale price, he said. I'll ride to Harlan's Crossing tomorrow and speak to Ferris. All right. He pushed back from the table, stood up, reached for his coat on the hook by the door, and then stopped with it in his hands, not putting it on. He was looking at the window and the snow-whitened yard beyond it, and she could see the particular kind of thinking happening in his face, the deeper kind, the kind that isn't really about the thing that's right in front of you. When I hired you, he said, I thought I was solving a problem about meals. She waited. I wasn't, he said, and put his coat on and went out. She sat at the table for a moment with the notebook in her hands and the kitchen quiet around her, and then she got a clean sheet of paper and started writing. Ferris came out on a Thursday. He was a stocky man in his 50s with a businessman's eye, yet and a rancher's knowledge, which was a combination she respected. He walked the near pasture with Caleb for 40 minutes, while Maeve watched from the kitchen window, pretending to be concerned with a pie she was making for no strategic reason whatsoever, and was absolutely not using as an excuse to stay within sight of the pasture. She'd put on fresh coffee, just in case. She heard them come in the back door. She had the coffee on the table and the pie in the oven, and she was, to all appearances, simply a woman in a kitchen who had only the most passing interest in the conversation happening in the doorway. They've put on good weight, Ferris was saying. He had a voice like gravel moving in a pan, rough-textured, efficient. More than I'd have expected from that lot. What have you been feeding them? Kitchen supplementation, mostly, Caleb said. Mrs. Holloway's been managing it. There was a pause, and then Ferris looked over at her with an expression that was trying to decide whether to be skeptical or impressed, and landing somewhere in between. The cook? The cook, Caleb confirmed, without inflection. Ferris sat down at the table, accepted the coffee she poured without being asked, and studied her for a moment in the direct way of a man who's used to assessing things. You understand cattle? I understand food, she said, which amounts to the same thing if you pay attention long enough. He looked at Caleb. Something passed between them that she wasn't entirely party to. Then Ferris said the number. It was a good number, not extravagant, but fair. And more importantly, it was immediate. Cash purchase, delivery within a week, which put it well ahead of Gantry and Doyle's arrival. Caleb looked at her briefly. She kept her face neutral, which cost her some effort. We have a deal, Caleb said. They shook hands. Ferris took a slice of pie that she'd cut without being asked and declared it better than anything he'd eaten since his wife had been alive, which landed with a weight in the room that nobody addressed. and then he went back to Harlan's Crossing to arrange the purchase paperwork. After he left, the kitchen was quiet. Danny had apparently been lurking somewhere within earshot because he appeared in the doorway about 3 minutes after the sound of Ferris's horse faded, with an expression of concentrated anticipation. "Well?" "Mind your business," Caleb said, but the edge wasn't there. "Was it enough?" Danny pressed, looking between them. Caleb looked at Maeve. She did the math one more time, the fast version, in her head. "It's enough," she said. Danny made a sound that was somewhere between a shout and a gasp, and went back into the hallway with the particular energy of a young man who has received very good news and has no one immediately available to share it with. They heard him tell Pete somewhere in the back of the house, and Pete's slow, satisfied exhale, and then Hank's voice asking what was happening. And it rippled through the house the way things do when a weight that everyone has been pretending not to feel is suddenly not there anymore. Caleb was still looking at her. "Stop looking at me like that," she said, not unkindly. "I just fed some cows scraps." "You didn't just feed some cows scraps," he said. "I did the math," she said. "Anyone could have done the math." "No," he said. "Anyone could not have done the math. Anyone didn't notice the steers. Anyone didn't spend 4 months keeping records." He stopped, started again. "Anyone didn't stay." She looked at him. He was standing in the middle of her kitchen. She'd come to think of it as hers, she realized, somewhere in the past months without marking the moment. And his expression had the stripped quality it had only twice before. The night she'd showed him the notebook, and the night he'd told her about Margaret. She felt something move in her chest that she wasn't prepared to examine directly. She had not planned on that. She had planned on wages and a warm room and time enough to get back on her feet, and somewhere in the course of getting back on her feet, she had apparently also built something else without noticing, the way you sometimes cook a sauce so gradually that you don't realize it's reduced until you look at the pot and find it half the volume it used to be and twice as concentrated. "I'll start on supper," she said. He nodded once and went back out into the cold. Gantry arrived on the appointed day with a man named Doyle, who was exactly what she'd expected from Caleb's description. Compact, precise, wearing a suit that had no business being in Wyoming in February, carrying a leather case with brass fittings that telegraphed "I have made men uncomfortable before, and I expect to do so again today." Maeve had made coffee and kept herself in the kitchen. She heard the conversation from there. Not every word, but enough. Gantry's voice, nervous, she thought, which was interesting, and Doyle's, which was smooth and unhurried, the voice of a man who had all day and knew it. And then Caleb's voice, low, steady. And what he said, she heard clearly, because the kitchen door was not entirely closed. "The payment's already been made, Mr. Doyle. Completed transaction 3 days ago. I have the receipt here." A pause. "I believe that satisfies the terms." Silence from the Doyle side of the conversation. The particular silence of a calculation that isn't going the way it was supposed to. In the kitchen, Maeve poured herself a cup of coffee and looked out the window at the near pasture, which was empty now, the 11 steers gone to Ferris's operation down in the valley. The pasture looked bare without them. She'd gotten used to seeing them there every morning when she came to start the stove. She'd missed them, she realized, which was a strange thing to miss. She heard the conversation in the other room shift, Doyle asking questions in a different register now, assessing, recalculating. Gantry's nervous voice saying something about records. Caleb's voice, quiet and even, answering everything. Eventually she heard the door and the sound of horses leaving the yard. Caleb came into the kitchen alone. She turned around from the window. He was standing in the doorway with his coat still on, and his expression was doing something she hadn't seen it do before. Not the stripped openness of the vulnerable moments, not the careful neutral of his default, but something quieter and more private than either, like a man standing in a field after a storm has passed and accounting for what's still standing. "They're gone," he said. "I heard," she said. Doyle was angry. I imagine he was. He didn't show it. That type doesn't. But you could see it in how fast he wanted to leave once he understood the situation. Something moved at the corner of his mouth. A long ride for nothing. "Good," she said. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "Thank you." "You already thanked me." "I'm thanking you again," he said. She looked back at him. The kitchen was warm, the coffee was hot, and outside the snow was doing something the Wyoming snow occasionally did in late afternoon, catching the low light and turning it briefly, improbably gold. She thought of how she'd looked at this kitchen the first day. The sticky work table, the unsalvageable pot, the hostile cheese in the pantry, and what it was now, which was a place that felt, despite everything, like it belonged to her in some way that wages and a room contract didn't fully explain. She thought of the notebook under her mattress, fat with 4 months of careful numbers. She thought of a man pacing a floor at night and what it meant that she no longer heard him do it. "You're welcome," she said. Again. He nodded, turned to go. "Caleb," she said. He stopped. "The ranch needs some work this spring, the north fence line especially, and there's a section of the barn roof that's been bothering me since October." He looked back at her. "Bothering you? Structurally," she said. "It's not right." He was quiet for a moment, and in that silence she could see him understanding what she was actually saying, which was not about fences or roofs, which was about spring, which was about after. "I'll get a man to look at the roof," he said. "Good," she said, and went back to her stove. Doyle came back in April. Nobody had expected that. That was the thing that caught them off guard. Not his arrival itself, because Maeve had said to Caleb in February, the night after the banker left, that a man like that didn't take a loss and move on to the next thing. She'd said it quietly, standing at the kitchen counter, not as a warning so much as a statement of fact about a particular type of person she'd had occasion to study up close during the creditor years with Thomas. Men who worked for institutions that measured success by acquisition didn't recalibrate after one failed attempt. They found a different angle. Caleb had listened and nodded and gone upstairs. But April had come in warm and busy, the way Wyoming springs arrive after brutal winters. Not gently, but all at once, with an urgency that demanded immediate attention. The ground softening, the pastures needing assessment, the cattle coming through winter in varying conditions that required sorting and decision-making, and the particular controlled chaos of a ranch waking back up after months of cold weather containment. There had been the roof repair, which took 2 weeks because the carpenter from Harlan's Crossing had discovered that the problem was larger than the visible section, and had delivered this news with the satisfied grimness of a man who enjoys being the bearer of structural bad tidings. There had been a fence break in the north section that took 3 days to properly address. There had been Gertrude the hen, who had achieved some kind of philosophical breakthrough over the winter and now refused to lay at all and had taken to staring at Maeve through the kitchen window with an expression of sustained accusation. Maeve had been busy. They had all been busy. And in the particular exhaustion of a working spring, Doyle had slipped to the back of her mind, which was, she would later think, exactly where he'd wanted to be. He arrived on a Tuesday, unannounced this time, without gantry. Just Doyle and a younger man she didn't recognize riding into the yard in the mid-afternoon when Caleb was out with Pete in the east pasture and Maeve was the only person near enough to the house to see them come in. She watched them from the kitchen window. Doyle dismounted with the unhurried ease of a man who was comfortable arriving places uninvited. He looked at the house, then at the barn, then at the repaired section of roof with an expression she couldn't read from this distance, but that she didn't like the shape of. She went to the back door. "Mr. Doyle," she said from the porch. Not a greeting exactly. More of an acknowledgement that she'd seen him and wasn't pretending otherwise. He looked over at her. He had a lean face, clean-shaved, with eyes that did a lot of work without showing it. He was somewhere in his late 40s, and everything about him, the suit, the posture, the way he stood in someone else's yard like he was already calculating what it was worth, communicated a man who had been doing this long enough that the performance of civility had become genuine habit, which made him, she thought, more dangerous than someone who was openly hostile. "Mrs. Holloway," he said. He remembered her name. She noted that. "Mr. Ashcroft is in the east pasture," she said. "I can send someone to get him if you'd like to wait." "I'm happy to wait," he said pleasantly, and looked back at the barn. She sent Danny for Caleb and went back inside. She stood at the kitchen counter and breathed for a moment, deliberately. She knew this feeling, the particular cold clarity that came when something she'd been half expecting arrived. It wasn't panic, She'd burned through her capacity for panic somewhere around the fourth creditor visit in Laramie, and what lived in its place was a focused, almost irritable alertness. Her mind was already moving through what Doyle's presence here meant, cataloging what she knew and what she didn't, looking for the angle. The debt was paid. She knew that. Caleb had the receipt. But a paid debt didn't mean Harlan's Western Bank had given up interest in the property. It meant the specific instrument they'd been using was gone, and they needed a new one. She thought about Caleb's ledger. She'd looked at it twice more since December, both times with Caleb's knowledge. They'd established an odd, unspoken working arrangement in which she was allowed to look at the financial records as long as she then told him what she thought. She knew the ranch's position reasonably well, and she knew there was one thing in it that, in the right hands, could be made to look like a problem: the water rights. It was complicated. All water rights in Wyoming were complicated. A legacy of laws built on top of older agreements, built on top of arrangements so old they predated the territory itself. The Ashcroft Ranch's rights to the creek that ran through the northeast corner of the property were solid, she believed, but they were documented in a way that was ambiguous in one specific place, a 2-year gap in the recording history from the late 1870s when the county office had been in administrative chaos following the death of the county recorder and the fire that had damaged his office. Caleb knew about the gap. He'd mentioned it once as an annoying technicality. She'd noted it and said nothing at the time. A man like Doyle would have done more than note it. Caleb came in from the east pasture with mud on his boots and the alert wariness of a man who'd been told Doyle was back and had ridden fast to get here. He came through the back door, saw her face, and stopped. "What do you know?" he said. "The water rights gap," she said. "The recording break in 78 and 79. She watched him understand. It moved across his face like a change in light. "You think that's what he's here about?" "I think that's what he found," she said, "after February. He went looking for a different instrument, and that's what was there." Caleb stood very still for a moment. Outside, they could hear Doyle's voice, something he was saying to his companion, low and indistinct through the walls. Caleb's jaw worked slightly, which was his version of visible agitation. "How bad is the gap?" "That is, on its own, it's an inconvenience. In front of a territorial court, with the right lawyer arguing the right case." She stopped. "It's a better instrument than the debt was, because it touches the whole property, not just the loan amount. He could argue the ranch's primary water access is unproven." "He could argue it," she said carefully. "Whether he'd win is a different question. But an argument like that, even a losing one, costs money and time and creates uncertainty about the property's value, which is what he wants." Caleb looked at her directly. "Can it be fixed?" "Yes," she said, "but not this afternoon." He exhaled through his nose, pulled off his hat, and ran a hand through his hair, which was the most openly frustrated gesture she'd ever seen from him. "All right," he said, and put his hat back on. "I'll go speak with him." "I'll bring coffee," she said. "Don't let him into the desk room." He looked at her. "I wasn't going to let him into the desk room." "I know," she said. "I just wanted to say it." Something passed through his expression that wasn't quite a smile but occupied the same neighborhood. He went out through the front. She stayed in the kitchen for the first part of the conversation. She could hear voices from the main room. Caleb's steady and measured, Doyle's carrying the smooth cadence of someone who has rehearsed what he's saying without making it sound rehearsed. She brought coffee in and set it on the sideboard and observed what was happening with the practiced invisibility of someone who has spent enough time in rooms where they weren't considered to matter. Doyle's companion was younger than she'd realized, mid-20s, with the slightly dazed look of a man who is very new to something and is trying to conceal it. He was holding a leather document case across his knees and glancing between Doyle and Caleb with the anxious attention of a student in an examination he hadn't fully prepared for. Doyle himself was sitting in the chair nearest the window with his legs crossed and his hat on his knee, and an expression of such practiced reasonableness that it would have been easy, if you weren't paying close attention, to mistake it for genuine goodwill. "Mr. Ashcroft," he was saying, as she set out the cups, "I want to be clear that this isn't an adversarial visit. The bank simply has obligations to ensure—" "I paid the debt," Caleb said. "Flat. Not aggressive, but not leaving room either." "You did," Doyle agreed pleasantly. "In full, and the bank acknowledges that completely. This is a separate matter, a question of—" He paused, just long enough to let the pause work. Title clarity, specifically regarding riparian rights to the creek in the northeast section. She poured the coffee without looking at either of them. Those rights have been part of this property since my father's time, Caleb said. Certainly they've been exercised since your father's time, Doyle said, with a precision that was almost surgical. The question the bank's legal department has raised is whether the chain of documentation through the late 1870s is complete. There appears to be a recording gap. A recording gap that every other property in this county has some version of, Caleb said. The county recorder's office caught fire in '78. Indeed it did, Doyle said, and in most cases, subsequent documentation has been sufficient to establish continuity. In yours, another pause. This man was very good at pauses. Our legal team has some questions. Maeve had heard enough. She set the coffee pot back on the sideboard and left the room. She went to the kitchen. She sat down at the table with the notebook and opened it to a blank page. She needed to think, and thinking, for her, had always worked better with paper in front of her. She wrote down what she knew: the gap in the water rights recording, the nature of territorial water law in Wyoming, what she understood about how a legal challenge to riparian rights would proceed, which was not comprehensive knowledge, but not nothing either. Thomas's debt situation had required her to develop working familiarity with legal processes that she'd never wanted to understand and would have been happy never needing. She wrote, "What does he actually want? Not the water rights themselves. A bank didn't want to get into the business of managing a creek in northeast Wyoming. What Doyle wanted was leverage, something to hold over the ranch that made Caleb's position feel precarious enough that a sale at a bank-favorable price started to look like the more comfortable option. She wrote, what would make the leverage go away? Clear documentation of the water rights, which required either finding documentation that already existed from the gap period or establishing a new record sufficient to cover it, which required a lawyer and a county filing and probably several weeks of process that they did not have if Doyle was sitting in the front room right now and building his case. She sat with the pen above the paper for a moment, not writing. Then she wrote, who filed water claims in this county in the late 1870s? She put the pen down and went to find Danny. He was in the barn, brushing down one of the horses with the methodical patience he brought to physical work, and he looked up when she came in with the expression of a man who has heard voices he didn't like the sound of coming from the house. Who's here? He said. The bank man from February, she said. Doyle. Danny, how long has Pete been on this ranch? Danny blinked at the change of direction. 12 years, he said once, maybe 13. So he was here in the early 80s. Before that, I think. He came with Mr. Ashcroft's father, I think he said. Or right after. She looked at him for a moment. Where is Pete right now? Fixing the water trough in the south field. Danny's expression had gone from confused to watchful. He was picking up on something, even without the full shape of it. What are you thinking? I'm thinking Pete's been here since before the gap, she said, and a man who's been on a property for 15 years using a creek, watching water rights be exercised, that's a kind of documentation. Danny was quiet for a moment. Testimony, he said. Properly filed, she said, with a notary. It's not a permanent solution, but it's something to set against whatever Doyle brought in that case of his. She was working it out as she said it, the logic of it firming up as it hit the air. Go get Pete, she said, quietly. Don't bring him through the front. Danny was already moving. Pete came in the back door 15 minutes later, still in his work coat, with the deliberate calm of a man who doesn't rush but understands when urgency is involved. He looked at Maeve at the kitchen table with the notebook in front of her and said simply, What do you need? She told him. His face didn't change much while she talked. Pete's face rarely did, but his eyes sharpened in a way that told her he understood both what she was asking and why. I can write it out, he said. What I've seen over the years, water usage, maintenance, the original pipe my father... He stopped. Mr. Ashcroft's father, he corrected, put in the channel from the creek to the South Trough in 1876. I helped him do it. I was 17. I remember it clearly. Can you put dates on it? Some of them. The channel work I'm certain of. The '79 spring flooding I remember because we lost 2 head when the creek ran high and it nearly took the channel with it. He paused. I remember the county recorder's fire because one of the hands at the time had a cousin who worked in that office, and we all heard about it. Maeve was writing while he talked, getting it down. Who's the notary in Harlan's Crossing? Edmonds, Pete said, at the general store. Is he trustworthy? He's been there 25 years, Pete said, which wasn't quite an answer to the question she'd asked, but was possibly a better one. She looked at what she'd written. It was rough. It would need to be recopied cleanly, but the substance was there. Continuous, specific, dated testimony of water rights usage stretching back to 1876 through the recording gap to the present. Not ironclad. A real lawyer could probably find issues with it, but a real lawyer would also have to contend with it, and contending with it cost time and money and introduced uncertainty into Doyle's calculation. She was trying to make Doyle's calculation harder. That was all. She wasn't trying to win a legal case today. She was trying to make today not worth the trouble. Pete, she said, I need you to do something uncomfortable. Seems like, he said, I need you to go into the front room and tell Mr. Ashcroft that you'd like a word with him, in the kitchen. He understood immediately, getting Caleb out of the room without it looking like a retreat, without tipping Doyle that anything was happening. Pete had been around long enough to know how to move through a situation without advertising it. He nodded once, smoothed his mustache, and went. 30 seconds later, she heard Pete's voice in the front room and then the low exchange of voices and then Caleb's footsteps in the hallway. He came into the kitchen and closed the door behind him. His eyes went to the paper on the table, then to her face. Pete's testimony, she said quietly, keeping her voice below what would carry through the door. Notarized in Harlan's Crossing. It won't solve the gap permanently, but it creates a counter-record that makes Doyle's legal challenge substantially messier and more expensive. Caleb looked at the paper. She could see him working through it. He can still file. He can, she said, but his value to the bank is in identifying properties worth acquiring with minimal resistance and minimal cost. If it becomes a contested legal process with documentary counter-evidence, the cost-benefit calculation changes. She paused. A man like Doyle moves on when the return doesn't justify the work. He has other properties. Caleb was quiet for a moment. She could hear faintly Doyle's companion shifting in his chair in the front room, the small sounds of a man trying to look occupied. How certain are you? Caleb asked. It was a good question. The honest answer was, not completely. She was a cook with a head for numbers and 4 years of Thomas's financial catastrophes as her primary legal education. She was not a lawyer, and she knew it. I'm certain that right now Doyle has the only counter-record on the table, she said. I'm certain that giving him a response today changes his calculation. I'm certain that doing nothing doesn't. She looked at him directly. The rest isn't certain. I can't make it certain, but I think the odds are better if we move than if we don't. Caleb held her gaze for a moment. Then he turned and went back to the front room. She stayed at the kitchen table and listened. She heard Caleb's voice change. It was subtle. He was still measured, still low, but something in the timbre of it shifted from the careful register of a man managing his responses to something more direct and less managed. She heard him say, clearly and without the careful modulation of the previous conversation, I have documentation. A pause from Doyle's direction. Continuous testimony from a witness with 15 years of presence on this property, Caleb continued. Dated water usage records going back to 1876. I've had it drawn up and it'll be notarized in Harlan's Crossing this week. Another pause. Longer. That's a matter for the courts to weigh, Doyle said. His voice was still smooth, but something underneath it had changed. A very slight recalibration. Barely audible, like a clock spring being tightened one turn. The bank's legal team will need to review. Of course, Caleb said. Review it. I'd also suggest your legal team review the cost of a territorial water rights challenge against a property that has documentary counter-evidence and a 15-year witness, against a payment that's already been made in full. A beat. But that's the bank's business. Silence. Then Doyle said, We'll be in touch, Mr. Ashcroft. I expect you will be, Caleb said. She heard the sounds of departure, the polite, brittle exchanges of men ending a conversation that hadn't gone where one of them wanted it to go. The front door. Boots on the porch. The particular quality of quiet that a room takes on after people who are trying to take something from it have left. She sat at the kitchen table and let out a breath she hadn't been entirely aware of holding. Caleb came back into the kitchen. He stood in the doorway for a moment, looking at her. She looked back at him. "He'll be in touch," Caleb said. "He might be," she said. "Or he might find a different property." "You don't know which." "No," she admitted. "I don't. But his case got harder today, and harder cases are less valuable to a man who makes his living off easy ones." She paused. "It's the same principle as the steers. You don't have to beat someone completely. Sometimes you just have to make beating you cost more than it's worth." Caleb leaned against the doorframe. He did that sometimes, leaned against things rather than sitting down, as if he wasn't fully committing to being in a room. She'd noticed it from the early days and had come to understand it as a physical expression of the way he held himself back from things in general. Kept one hand on the door. "I need to get those rights properly documented," he said. "A real lawyer, a real filing." "Yes," she said. "That needs to happen regardless of what Doyle does next. There's a man in Buffalo, Jenkins. He handled the estate when Margaret—" He stopped, started again. "He did work for me before. He's competent. Write to him this week," she said. He nodded. He was still looking at her with that quality of attention she'd never quite gotten used to, the kind that made her feel simultaneously very clearly seen and slightly uncertain about what was being seen. "Maeve," he said. "I know," she said preemptively. "You're going to thank me again." "I was going to say something else," he said. She waited. He was quiet for long enough that she started to wonder whether he'd changed his mind, which was a thing he sometimes did. Started toward something and then decided the distance was too far and came back from it. But this time he didn't come back. "I've been thinking," he said, "about what this ranch is, what it is now versus what it was." He looked at the kitchen, the clean work table, the organized shelves, the window she'd replaced the cracked pane in back in March with glass she'd special ordered and installed herself because she'd been tired of looking at the crack and nobody else had gotten around to it. "When Margaret died, I thought the best I could do was keep it going. Just keep the cattle alive and the men paid and the bank satisfied. Maintenance, not—" He searched for the word and found it. "Not building." She said nothing. The kitchen was very quiet. "You've been building," he said, "without anyone asking you to. Without it even being your ranch." He paused. "And I've been watching you do it for 6 months, and I keep thinking—" The sound of Danny's boots on the back porch interrupted him. Danny came through the door with the magnificent timing of a person who has no idea they've walked into the middle of something, took one look at the two of them, and stopped dead. "Should I—" He pointed back outside. "Yes," Caleb said. "Right," Danny said, and went back outside. In the silence that followed, something shifted. The interrupted moment didn't resume itself exactly, but it left a residue in the room, a shape of what hadn't quite been said that occupied the air between them. Caleb pushed off the doorframe. "I'll write to Jenkins tonight," he said. "All right," she said. "And Pete, I'll speak to him about the testimony. He shouldn't have to do that without knowing why." "He already knows why," she said. "Pete always knows why." Something moved at the corner of Caleb's mouth. That same not-quite smile she'd catalogued over the past months, the one that appeared when she'd said something that matched his own understanding of a person. He was more readable now than he'd been in October. She'd learned him the way you learn a piece of difficult ground, not all at once but incrementally, step by step, until you knew which parts were solid and which parts you had to be careful with. He turned and went to the desk room. She heard the drawer open, the sound of paper, the scratch of a pen starting a letter. She sat at the kitchen table for another minute, looking at Pete's testimony in her notebook, at the dates and the details and the careful reconstruction of 15 years of continuous use of a creek that nobody had ever questioned until someone with a leather case and a suit that didn't belong in Wyoming had decided it was worth questioning. Outside, she could hear Danny moving around the barn with exaggerated noisiness, making absolutely certain he wasn't going to accidentally interrupt anything again. She got up and started on supper. The ranch needed feeding. Whatever else was happening, whatever Doyle might do next, whatever unfinished thing had been sitting in the kitchen doorway between her and Caleb since he'd started a sentence and Danny's boots had ended it, All of that would still be there after the men had eaten. The work of a day didn't stop for the complicated parts. She'd learned that much, at least, from 6 months on the Wyoming frontier. She got the pot on and started the biscuits, and the kitchen filled with the smell of something warm and real and worth coming in for. And outside, the April evening was settling over the Ashcroft Ranch in the long, slow way of spring light when it finally decides to stay. Jenkins wrote back in 3 weeks. The letter was thorough, which was what she'd hoped for, and expensive, which was what she'd expected. Caleb read it at the breakfast table on a Thursday morning in late April, while the men ate around him with the careful inattentiveness of people who know something is being read and have decided not to appear to be watching. When he set it down, he looked at Maeve, who was at the stove and had been not watching with the rest of them. He can fix it, Caleb said. 6 to 8 weeks for the full filing. He wants Pete's testimony in writing before he comes out. Pete already has it written, she said. It's been sitting in the desk room since February. Caleb looked at her for a moment. Of course it has. I made a clean copy after Doyle left, she said. Seemed like the kind of thing that shouldn't wait. From the end of the table, Pete smoothed his mustache and said nothing, which was his way of expressing approval. The water rights matter moved into the background after that, not resolved, but in motion, handed to someone with the specific qualifications to handle it properly. Maeve had learned, in the months on this ranch, the particular discipline of knowing when to hold a problem and when to put it down. She'd held the steer situation for 4 months because it required her direct involvement. The legal question required a lawyer, and once it was in Jenkins's hands, continuing to carry it herself was just extra weight. May arrived and the ranch accelerated into its working season. The cattle that had wintered down were moved north. New calves required attention. 2 of the horses needed the farrier, which meant a trip to Harlan's Crossing that Caleb made with Walt, while Maeve managed the kitchen and the yard and the ongoing diplomatic situation with Gertrude, who had finally resumed laying but did so with an air of profound reluctance that suggested she considered it a personal favor and expected to be recognized accordingly. The days got longer. The work filled them. And underneath the work, something was changing between Caleb and Maeve in the slow, unannounced way that things change when 2 people spend enough time in close quarters being honest with each other. It wasn't dramatic. There was no single moment she could point to and say, that's when it shifted. It was accumulated instead. The 100 small things that built up like sediment over months until the riverbed was different from what it had been, and you couldn't quite say when the change had happened, only that it had. He started telling her things. Not large things. Not at first. Small ones. An observation about the North Pasture. A memory about a horse his father had kept. A story about the first winter he'd run the ranch alone after his father died, when he'd been 24 and had no idea what he was doing, and had kept that ignorance hidden from the hands by the sheer force of acting like he did. She'd listened to that one carefully, filing it away. Not because it was useful information, but because it was him. The younger version of the man she'd spent 7 months watching. The version who'd been scared and hadn't shown it. Did it work? She'd asked. Acting like you knew? Mostly, he said. Pete knew I didn't. He never said anything. Pete wouldn't. No, Caleb said. He'd just quietly fix the things I was doing wrong and let me think I'd figured it out myself. She'd thought about that. About the different ways people help each other, and how often the most effective kind is the kind that lets the person being helped believe they help themselves. She didn't say that out loud. She was getting better at knowing which thoughts needed speaking and which ones were fine where they were. It was a Saturday in late May when it happened, and it happened the way she should have expected. Sideways, without preparation, in the middle of something ordinary. She was in the kitchen garden. She'd started it in early April, working the ground herself because nobody had asked her to, and nobody had stopped her. A practical patch of earth along the south wall of the house where she'd put in onions and potatoes and a row of beans, and some sage and thyme to replace the dried-out ghosts of those herbs she'd found in the kitchen on her first day. It wasn't large. It wasn't a statement. It was just useful ground being put to use. She was on her knees pulling the early weeds from between the bean seedlings, which were coming up determinedly, despite a cold snap the previous week that had made her genuinely worried about them, when she heard Caleb's boots on the ground behind her. She didn't turn around. She'd developed, over the months, a particular sense of his presence, the weight of his footsteps, the quality of his approach. Whether he was coming toward her with something on his mind or just passing through, he was coming toward her with something on his mind. He stopped a few feet behind her. She could feel him standing there, not speaking yet, in the way he had of holding a silence until he was sure of what he wanted to put into it. She sat back on her heels and looked at the bean seedlings and waited. "I've been trying to figure out how to say something for about 3 weeks," he said. "I know," she said. A brief pause. "You know. You've been starting sentences at supper and then not finishing them," she said. "You don't usually do that. You either say a thing or you don't say it." I haven't been sure which category this fell into. She turned around then. He was standing in the May sunlight with his hat in his hands. He'd taken it off, which she noticed, which he didn't usually do outdoors. And he looked like a man who had made a decision and was now on the other side of it, in the exposed terrain of having committed to something before knowing the outcome. "Maeve," he said, and then stopped again, which was almost funny, except that the expression on his face made it impossible to treat as funny. "Caleb," she said, "just say it." He looked at her directly. "I don't want you to be the cook here." The sentence landed oddly. She waited for the rest of it. "I mean—" He stopped, started again. "You have been. And you've been—" He seemed frustrated with himself in a way that was unusual for him, his normal precision failing him at exactly the moment he needed it most. "This is coming out wrong." "Keep going," she said. "I don't want you to stay because you need somewhere to stay," he said. "I don't want you to stay because I'm paying you to. I don't want there to be a wage involved in why you're here. Do you understand what I'm—" He stopped again. His jaw worked slightly. Then he said, more quietly and more directly than anything he'd said yet, "I want you to stay because you want to be here, not because you're working here, because this is yours, if you want it to be." She looked at him. The bean seedlings were coming up behind her. The south wall of the house was warm with the morning sun. Somewhere on the other side of the property, she could hear Danny's voice and one of the horses objecting to something Danny was doing, which was a sound she'd heard so many times in the past 7 months that it had become part of the texture of this place, of what it sounded like to be here. She thought about this first day. The trail, the berries, the question that hadn't been pity. "Can you cook for 2? She thought about the notebook under her mattress, which had 200 pages of careful numbers in it and was almost full. She'd been thinking she'd need a new one soon. She thought about the kitchen with the cracked window pane she'd replaced, because she was tired of looking at the crack. The garden she'd started because the ground was there and ought to be used. The 11 steers she still missed with an affection that she found slightly embarrassing when she examined it directly. She thought about a man pacing a floor at night and how she didn't hear it anymore. "You're asking me to marry you," she said. Not a question, just naming the thing. He held her gaze. "Yes." "You could have said that directly." "I know," he said. "I was getting there." She looked at him for a moment, at his face, which she knew well enough now to read in the ways that mattered, at the hat in his hands that he was holding with more tension than he probably realized, at the man who had given Danny a chance on the word of a stranger 3 years ago, who kept his hands long-term because he treated them fairly, who had spent 2 years going quieter and quieter inside his own grief, and had started sometime over the past winter to come back from it, who had looked at a starving woman on a trail and asked a question that wasn't pity, who had told her in the small hours of a February night that his wife would have liked her and had meant it as the most honest thing he could offer. She was not a woman who made decisions from sentiment. She'd learned that lesson with Thomas. Not that Thomas had been wrong to marry, but that she'd married him on the feeling of him without enough reckoning with the substance. She'd spent the years since correcting for that imbalance, sometimes too far in the other direction, calculating everything, trusting the numbers more than her own instincts. But her instincts, she thought, had not actually been wrong. She'd known Thomas was a good man. He had been. He'd just also been a man who couldn't manage money and couldn't stop accumulating debt and had left her with 43 cents and a worn-out pair of boots and a trail in Wyoming going nowhere particular. Caleb Ashcroft was a different kind of man. She knew that with the same certainty she'd felt about the 11 steers. Not a hope, but a calculation. 7 months of close observation, careful notation, working evidence. "I have conditions," she said. Something shifted in his face. Relief, she thought, disguised as attention. "All right. The kitchen garden is mine. I'll expand it next year and I want a proper fence around it before winter. He nodded, once. My wages through the end of this month get paid out regardless. What I've earned is mine, and I want it in my own keeping. That's fair, he said. And the ledger, she said. I want to keep working with it, not because you can't manage it, you can, but because I'm better at the particular thing I do with it than you are, and it would be a waste to stop. He was quiet for a moment. She watched him consider this, not defensively but genuinely, turning it over, looking at it from the angles a practical man looks at things. You'd want to be involved in the ranch decisions, he said, not just the books. I'm already involved in the ranch decisions, she said. I'd like to stop pretending I'm not. His mouth moved. It was the most complete version of a smile she'd gotten from him in 7 months, the one that reached his eyes and changed the whole geography of his face, and it lasted only a moment before it settled back into his usual expression, but she'd seen it and she kept it. Those are your conditions, he said. Those are the ones I thought of on short notice, she said. I reserve the right to add more. That seems like a condition in itself. It is, she said. Do you accept it? He looked at her with the quiet, settled quality of a man who has made a decision he's confident in. Yes, he said. She stood up from the garden bed, brushing the dirt from her knees with the practical efficiency of a woman who has been kneeling in the earth and knows that ceremony is for people with less to do. She looked at him, this lean, weathered, careful man with his hat in his hands and Wyoming behind him in all directions. Then yes, she said, I'll stay. He reached out and took her hand, not dramatically, just took it, the way people hold things they intend to keep. His hand was rough from work and warm from the May sun, and she held it back with the same straightforward intention. They stood in the kitchen garden for a moment, neither of them saying anything, which suited them both. They told the men at supper, or rather Caleb told them, in the brief and unelaborated way he told people most things. Mrs. Holloway and I are getting married. Thought you should know. And then he picked up his fork and continued eating. The silence that followed lasted approximately 1.5 seconds, which was how long it took Danny to process the information, and then Danny made the sound again. The half-shout, half-gasp that he'd made in February when she'd told them the numbers were enough, and pushed back from the table with a scrape of his chair and looked at Maeve with an expression of such complete and uncomplicated happiness that she had to look away from it briefly, because it hit somewhere she wasn't prepared for. Pete said, well, and nodded once, with the weight of a man who has been watching something build for months and is not surprised, but is satisfied. That was all Pete said. It was enough. Red said, congratulations, and meant it, and Walt reached across and shook Caleb's hand with the grave formality of a man who takes handshakes seriously. And Hank, who had the least to say of any of them on most occasions, said, about time, and went back to his biscuit. Danny was still standing. Does this mean we're keeping you? He said to Maeve, and then seemed to realize the question was slightly strange given the announcement, and turned red. Danny, she said, sit down and eat your supper. He sat. He was grinning in a way that suggested he'd be grinning for some time, and she found she didn't mind it, which was its own kind of information about how much this place had become hers without her noticing. After supper, after the men had gone and the kitchen was cleaned, she and Caleb sat at the table with coffee, a habit they'd developed over the winter, these quiet kitchen table evenings that weren't quite anything but had become the part of the day she thought about during the rest of it. Jenkins will be done with the water rights filing by midsummer, Caleb said. That seems like a reasonable time. For what? For the wedding. He looked at her over his coffee. If you want something, a ceremony. I don't know what you'd prefer. She thought about it honestly. She'd had a small wedding with Thomas. A minister, a rented dress, her mother in the front row crying with the particular mixture of joy and apprehension that her mother brought to everything. The dress had gone the same way as everything else Thomas had left her with. The memory she kept because she'd want to, not because it demanded keeping. Nothing large, she said. Something real. That's what I'd want too, he said. She nodded. Outside, the May evening had gone fully dark, and through the kitchen window she could see the first stars coming up over the Bighorn foothills, the same sky she'd walked under in October, counting berries. Remarkable, she thought. What could change in 7 months if you walked into it instead of away from it? There's one more thing, she said. He waited. The porch step, she said. The cracked one. It needs to be replaced before winter. He looked at her for a moment with an expression she'd come to understand as his version of warmth. Not soft, not demonstrative, but genuine in the specific way that things are genuine when they aren't performed. I'll see to it, he said. This week, she said. This week, he agreed. She finished her coffee and got up to rinse the cups. He stayed at the table and she could feel him behind her tech, not watching her exactly, just present, the way he'd been present for 7 months in the incremental, unhurried way of someone who wasn't going anywhere. She thought, this is what I chose. Not the rescue of it, not the security of it, not the relief of having somewhere to land. The work of it. The difficult man with the careful silences and the grief he was still carrying and the pacing feet that had gone quiet. The ranch with the cracked porch step and the hostile hen and the north fence that needed attention every spring. The table full of men she'd learned and who had learned her in return. The life that had been built out of necessity and was now being chosen on purpose, which was a different and better thing. She set the cups on the rack to dry and turned around. Caleb was still at the table, looking at the window in the dark beyond it, and she thought again, as she had on her first night in her small room while he paced above her, that she understood something about being caught in circles of your own making. The difference now was that she could see he was coming out of it, slowly, imperfectly, with the reversals she didn't expect and silences that still sometimes went on too long. But coming out of it. Caleb, she said. He looked at her. Go to bed, she said. You've got the east fence tomorrow. He stood up, and there it was again, the not-quite smile, the one that changed his whole face for a moment before it settled. Good night, Maeve, he said. Good night, she said. She stood in her kitchen, the kitchen that was hers now, in the way she'd said, in the way she'd meant, in the way she intended to keep, and listened to his footsteps go up the stairs steady and unhurried and stop. No pacing, just quiet. And the sound of the Wyoming night outside the walls, and the first stars over the Bighorn foothills holding their positions in the dark, like they'd always been there and always would be, indifferent and ancient and entirely beautiful. She turned off the kitchen lamp and went to bed. Jenkins finished the water rights filing on a Wednesday in July, and the document that came back from the territorial office was so thoroughly and unambiguously clear in its language that Caleb read it twice at the kitchen table, before setting it down with the expression of a man who has been bracing for impact for so long that the absence of it takes a moment to register. That's it, he said. That's it, she said. She'd read it over his shoulder, which she did now without asking because they'd been past the point of asking about such things for months. Doyle can't touch it. Not this, she said. No. He set the document down on the table and looked at it for another moment. Then he looked at her. You know what this means. It means the ranch is secure, she said. It means the ranch is yours, he said, as much as mine. Whatever you put into this from the beginning, it's in the ground now, can't be taken back out. She thought about that, about the way some things, once you've committed them to a place, become part of the place itself. The garden along the south wall, Pete's testimony in the county records, the extra weight on 11 steers, the ledger with her handwriting in the margins going back to December, careful and specific and entirely hers. She'd put herself into this ground. She just hadn't thought of it in those terms until now. We should fix the north fence before we do anything else, she said. He looked at her with the expression he'd been giving her more frequently since May, the one that mixed exasperation and something warmer in proportions that changed depending on the moment. I just told you the ranch is secure and you're thinking about the fence. The fence doesn't fix itself because the paperwork is done, she said. Come to that, the north fence has needed proper attention since March, and we've been patching it. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, Do you ever stop? She considered this honestly. Not really, she said. Do you want me to? He picked up the Jenkins document and folded it carefully, which was his way of not answering a question while still answering it. I'll get Red and Walt on the north fence tomorrow, he said. Good, she said. They were married the following Saturday in the yard of the ranch, under a sky that was the particular deep blue of Wyoming midsummer, with Jenkins as the witness because he was already there, and Pete as the other because he'd been asked and had accepted with the single nod he gave to things he considered settled matters. Danny had wanted to say something and had been gently discouraged from this by Pete, who had some sense of occasion even if Danny did not. It was not a beautiful wedding in the conventional way of weddings. Maeve wore her second-best dress because her best one had acquired a permanent stain from a preserving project in late June, and she hadn't gotten around to replacing it. Caleb wore his good coat, which was clean and properly brushed, because she'd seen to it the night before without telling him she was doing it. The ceremony itself was short. The circuit judge who rode through Harlan's Crossing quarterly happened to be in town that week, which Caleb had known and arranged, and the judge had the efficient manner of a man who had performed this particular function many times, and understood that brevity was its own form of respect. Afterward, she made a proper supper, because someone had to, and she was the best person for it, and the men ate around the yard table in the summer evening, and Danny did say something after all. A toast that rambled for nearly 2 minutes and covered topics including his mother's kitchen in Indiana, the particular quality of Maeve's oat bread, and his personal theory that Pete had known this was going to happen since at least November, which Pete neither confirmed nor denied. And Red produced a bottle of whiskey from somewhere that nobody asked about, and it passed around the table while the July night came down soft and warm over the Bighorn foothills. Maeve sat next to Caleb at the table and thought, "This is a thing that happened." She held it lightly, the way you hold things you don't want to examine too closely for fear of disturbing them. Under the table, Caleb's hand found hers and stayed there. She held that lightly, too. 5 years is not a long time in the life of a piece of land. The Bighorn Basin had been there long before anyone had thought to fence it, and would be there long after the fences were gone. But in the life of a ranch, in the particular and precarious human project of trying to make something sustainable from something uncertain, 5 years could be the difference between a place that existed and a place that meant something. By the autumn of the 5th year, the Ashcroft Ranch meant something. The herd had nearly doubled, not from any single dramatic decision, but from the accumulated effect of better management, which was partly Caleb's improved attention now that he wasn't spending half his energy managing his own grief, and partly Maeve's habit of watching things before they became problems, which she applied to cattle with the same methodical patience she'd applied to 11 underweight steers in a near pasture in October 4 years ago. The north pasture that had been stripped and overworked in the first year was rotated now on a schedule she'd mapped out in her second notebook, which had followed the first one and been followed by a third. The herd's average weight at market had gone up for 3 consecutive years. The kitchen garden along the south wall had expanded twice, and now occupied a long, properly fenced strip that grew more variety than she'd originally planned. Vegetables for the kitchen, yes, but also some herbs she'd started purely because she wanted them. And in the 3rd year, a row of flowers along the fence line that Danny had looked at with an expression of puzzlement the first time he'd seen them going in. "What are those for, Miss?" he'd asked. "Looking at," she'd said. He'd absorbed this information and moved on. And by the second summer, he was the one who most consistently stopped to look at them, which she'd noted privately and never mentioned to him. Pete had retired from hard range work 2 years ago. His back had made the decision for him, with the authority that bodies eventually exercise over people who have been ignoring them for too long. But he hadn't left the ranch. Nobody had suggested he should. He moved slower now and took shorter days and had shifted from fence work and cattle management to a more general role of knowing things and being available to be asked them, which suited him and suited everyone else. He had a better room now, on the ground floor, that Caleb had given up without being asked. The winter Pete's back had made the stairs a genuine difficulty. This had not been discussed. One day the room was Pete's room, that was all. Danny had grown into himself somewhere in the 3rd year. The ears that had outpaced his face had found their proportion. He'd taken on more responsibility with the horses, which was where his actual talent lay. Walt had recognized it before anyone else, and had spent 2 winters teaching him what he knew. And what Danny had done with that knowledge had moved past what Walt had given him into something of his own. The year prior, a rancher from 2 properties over had offered Danny a position specifically for his horse work, at better wages than Caleb was paying. Danny had turned it down. He told Caleb about the offer, which Maeve thought showed more character than the decision itself, and Caleb had raised his wages without comment and the subject had closed. Red and Walt were still there. Hank had left in the 3rd year, not badly, not from any conflict, just with the natural drift of a man who needed different ground than he'd found. He'd written once from Montana to say he was doing well, and Maeve had written back, and that had been that. His place had been taken by a woman named Ruth, who was 50 years old and had come from Kansas with a particular expertise in cattle medicine that made her more valuable on the ranch than 3 ordinary hands, and who ate at the kitchen table with the ease of someone who expected to be treated as an equal and got exactly that. And after the first 2 weeks, the men had stopped noticing she was anything other than what she was, which was better at her job than most of them were at theirs. The porch step had been replaced in the first summer. The barn roof was solid. There was a new section of fence along the property's western boundary that Caleb had built with Walt over 3 weeks in the 4th autumn, properly sunk and properly strung, the kind of fence that announced itself as permanent rather than provisional. Jenkins had come out twice more, once for the water rights follow-up and once for something unrelated to crisis, which Maeve had privately marked as a milestone. You knew you were in a different place when you engaged a lawyer for reasons other than emergency. Doyle had not come back. They'd heard, through the particular information network of small towns and neighboring ranches, that he'd moved his attention to properties further east, which was either because the Ashcroft situation had genuinely not been worth the trouble or because he was building towards something that hadn't materialized yet. Maeve had decided, at some point in the 3rd year, to stop waiting for the second explanation. Not because it was impossible, but because waiting for it was a way of giving him space in her life that he hadn't earned. Some things you let go of because you've solved them. Some things you let go of because holding them is its own kind of loss. The boy arrived in the 2nd year. They'd been careful with each other about that particular hope, not discussing it much, not in the direct way. The way people are careful with things that matter so much. The careful handling itself becomes a kind of acknowledgement of how much they matter. When Maeve had been certain enough to say something, she told Caleb in the kitchen, in the morning, before the hands were up. He'd been standing at the window with his coffee, and she'd said it plainly, and watched him turn around and look at her with an expression she had no word for and wouldn't try to find one. He'd set his coffee down and come across the kitchen and held her for a moment, which was unusual for him in the way that the truest things often are, rare enough to mean something specific. "Are you all right?" he'd said, against the top of her head. "I'm fine," she said. "I'm also going to be sick in about 45 minutes, but at the moment I'm fine." He'd made a sound that was the full version of the laugh she'd been collecting fragments of for over a year. She'd held on to that sound for the months that followed when things were difficult, and some of them were difficult, in the unglamorous and physically unpleasant way that pregnancy is difficult, which nobody adequately describes to you in advance, and which Maeve navigated with the same stubborn practicality she'd applied to everything else, plus occasional lapses into a misery she confined to private moments and refused to make anyone else's problem. The boy came in the autumn of the 2nd year, difficult and loud and with a full head of dark hair and an expression, in those first minutes, of such complete outrage at the conditions of the world he'd been delivered into that the midwife from Harlan's Crossing had said she'd never seen a newborn that opinionated. "He looks like you," Maeve had said to Caleb, exhausted past all pretense. Caleb had been holding the boy with the careful tension of a man who had not held many babies and was worried about doing it wrong, and he'd looked up at her with something in his face that was too large and too unguarded for her to look at directly. "Yeah," he'd said quietly. "Maybe." They'd named him William, after Caleb's father, with the understanding that he'd be called Will because William was 2 syllables too many for a child who, as it turned out, moved fast and needed a name that could keep up with him. Will Ashcroft at 3 years old was a precise and detailed catastrophe. He was interested in everything, afraid of very little, and had apparently inherited Maeve's habit of watching things carefully before deciding what to do with them, combined with Caleb's ability to then do those things without any apparent concern for his own safety. He had also, by some separate mechanism, inherited Danny's inability to leave a silence unfilled, which meant the ranch that had been quiet for so many years was now filled from morning to night with the particular running commentary of a small person discovering the world and needing everyone nearby to know about it. Pete, who said little to most people, talked to Will constantly. Low, unhurried conversations that Maeve would overhear sometimes from the kitchen window. Pete pointing at something, Will examining it with his small, serious face, asking the questions that 3-year-olds ask, which are mostly why and occasionally what happens if. Pete's better with him than he is with most adults, Caleb observed one evening. Pete's always been better with people who are honest about what they don't know, she said. Caleb had considered that for a moment. That's true, he'd said. That's exactly true. Awesome. It was an October evening in the 5th year when Maeve stood in the kitchen garden, the expanded one, properly fenced, with the flower row along the eastern edge that had been her quiet insistence and nobody's problem but hers, and looked at the ranch in the flat, low light that came at the end of October days in the Bighorn Basin. The cattle were in the near pasture now, the herd she could name the decisions behind, each animal carrying in its condition the evidence of the choices made over 5 years. The feeding schedules, the rotation maps, the medical attentions Ruth had provided with the blunt efficiency of someone who cared more about outcomes than impressions. The barn roof was solid against the coming winter. The north fence was sound. The house, 2-storied and substantial, and no longer wearing its neglect like an apology, sat in the evening light with the quality of a place that was genuinely occupied rather than merely maintained. She heard the back door and turned around. Caleb was coming across the yard with Will on his shoulders, which was a logistical solution to the problem of Will's current preference for moving in directions other than the one the adults were moving in. Will had a piece of dried grass he'd found somewhere, and was examining it with the focused attention he brought to objects of interest, which included everything. "Supper's not on yet," she said. "I know," Caleb said. "We're not hungry yet." Will looked up from the grass and saw her and said, "Mama, Pete showed me a thing," with the urgency of someone delivering important news. "What kind of thing?" she asked. "A track," Will said. "In the mud by the creek. Pete said it was a fox, but I think it was too big." "Pete knows more about tracks than you do," she said. Will considered this. "He said I was asking good questions," he offered, as though this mitigated the disagreement about the fox. "He's right about that," she said. "You do ask good questions." Will seemed satisfied with this and went back to the grass. Caleb set him down, and he went immediately toward the garden fence with the clear intention of climbing it, which he'd been told not to do, and which he did anyway, consistently, because he was 3, and because the instruction made no apparent sense to him. "Will," Caleb said. Will reconsidered this fence, found a compromise in leaning on it rather than climbing it, and began a detailed examination of the flower stems, which were dead now from the cold but still standing. Maeve looked at the 2 of them, the man and the boy, one tall and deliberate and the other small and in perpetual motion, against the background of the ranch in the evening light, and felt something that wasn't quite contentment, because contentment was too still a word for what she generally felt, which was more like the satisfaction of a calculation that keeps checking out. You run the numbers and the numbers are good, and you run them again because you want to be sure, and they're still good, and eventually you put the notebook down. She'd been putting the notebook down more often lately. That was new. That was something she was still getting used to. "The herd's in good shape going into winter," Caleb said. He was standing beside her now, looking at the near pasture with the assessing eye he brought to every autumn inventory. "Better than last year," she agreed. Ruth's work with the 2 sick calves in August made a difference. "I want to talk to her about staying on permanently," he said. "Not seasonally." "I think she'd say yes," Maeve said. "She's put roots down. You can see it in how she talks about the place." Caleb nodded slowly. He did that, moved slowly toward things he'd already decided, as though the decision needed to travel through his whole body before it became official. "What else?" "The East Water Channel needs work in spring. The intake's been silting up since July, and it'll be worse after the freeze-thaw." She paused. "And I want to expand the root cellar before next winter. We're running out of room for what the garden's producing." He looked at her sideways. 5 years, and you're still making lists in your head. "Someone has to," she said. "Someone does," he agreed without argument. Will had found a dead flower stem he approved of and was conducting some kind of examination that required him to sit in the dirt, which was going to require attention to his trousers before supper. And neither of his parents mentioned this to him because sometimes you let small things go. Maeve thought about a trail in October, 5 years ago. The buffalo berries, 14 of them, tart and barely adequate, eaten one at a time in the particular manner of someone stretching inadequate resources as far as they'll go. The boots with the worn heels, the 43 cents. The quality of her own hunger that day, which had not been only physical, had been the deeper kind, the kind that doesn't know exactly what it's hungry for, only that the present situation is insufficient and the future is genuinely unclear. She thought about a question that wasn't pity. Can you cook for two? The funny thing, she thought now, was that the question had never really been about cooking. It had been about whether she was someone who could be useful in an exchange, whether she had something to offer that was worth offering. And she'd said yes, and meant the cooking part. And the cooking part had been real and had mattered. But what had actually been exchanged over the 5 years since that October trail was something that didn't have a ledger entry, something you couldn't quantify in the neat columns she still kept, the notebooks she still filled with her careful, specific handwriting. The thing you couldn't quantify was what happened when two people who had both lost things chose, in full knowledge of what loss felt like, to build something anyway. Not because they'd forgotten how bad losing was, but because they remembered it clearly and decided the building was worth it. That was the thing she couldn't have put in the notebook. That was the thing she'd learned out here, on this difficult, unglamorous, perpetually unfinished piece of Wyoming ground, that she hadn't known how to learn from the years with Thomas, who had also been worth loving, but had not been someone she could build with. The difference wasn't love. The difference was the building, the willingness to do the hard, unromantic, fence-mending, ledger-keeping, hostile chicken-managing work of making something last. You didn't conquer a frontier by being strong enough to overwhelm it. You survived it by being patient enough, practical enough, stubborn enough, and honest enough about your own limits to let someone else carry the part of the load you couldn't carry alone. She'd been very stubborn. She thought she'd continue to be. "Caleb," she said. The porch step," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "The porch step is fine," he said. "I replaced it 4 years ago." "The second one from the bottom," she said. "Feel it the next time you walk up. There's movement in it." He was quiet for longer this time. The silence of a man testing this claim against his own memory of the step and coming to an uncomfortable conclusion. "I'll look at it," he said finally. "Before winter," she said. "Before winter?" he said, with the patient exasperation of a man who has been having this particular kind of conversation for 5 years and has made his peace with the fact that it will continue indefinitely. Will looked up from the dirt. "What's wrong with the step?" he asked, with the alert attention of a child who had been ostensibly engaged elsewhere but had been listening to everything, as children do. "It needs fixing," Maeve said. "I can fix it," Will said, with complete confidence. "You're 3, his father said. "Almost 4, Will said. Caleb looked at Maeve. She looked back at him. The October light was doing what October light did in the Bighorn Basin, going gold and long and a little melancholy, the way good things going toward their end tend to do, which was just the nature of good things, and not a reason to think less of them. "Come on," Caleb said to both of them. "Let's go in." Will abandoned his flower stem and came to take his mother's hand, and they crossed the yard in the last of the evening light, past the garden she'd built from nothing, past the barn with its solid roof, past the near pasture with the herd that would carry the ranch through another winter, toward the house that had been empty and was now full, the porch with its almost loose second step, the kitchen that smelled like warmth because she'd left the stove going. She would fix the ledger entries tonight, after Will was in bed. She had numbers to update and notes from the summer she hadn't fully transferred to the main book. Caleb would sit at the other end of the table and read the week's mail and occasionally say something, and she would occasionally answer, and the kitchen would be quiet in the way it was quiet now. Not the quiet of absence, but the quiet of enough. She had 2 notebooks left in the desk room. She was already thinking about what she'd do when those ran out. The screen door closed behind them with its familiar sound, solid in its frame. The house taking them in the way a place does when it recognizes the people who belong to it, and outside the Wyoming dusk came down over the Bighorn foothills the way it always had, indifferent and enormous, and going its own way entirely, unbothered by the small, stubborn, improbable human life carrying on below it. The Ashcroft Ranch held its ground. It would hold it tomorrow, and the day after, and through the winter coming and the winters after that, not because fortune had been particularly kind, and not because the people inside it were anything more than ordinarily human, with ordinary limits and ordinary failures and the ordinary need to be forgiven for both. It would hold because of what got built there, one careful day at a time, by people who chose to build it. That was all. That was enough.